Known for his brooding screen presence and an almost unshakable aura of intensity, Charles Bronson rose to become one of Hollywood's most unforgettable icons of toughness. To audiences, he was the man who needed few words, a cold stare, and a steady hand to dominate the screen. He was often cast as a figure of violence, a man hardened by life, whose silence was more threatening than another actor's angry monologue. Yet behind the cinematic myth of guns, vengeance, and grit, there was another Charles Bronson, one whose real life was marked by unimaginable hardship, struggle, and determination. It has been more than 20 years since his death, but only in recent years have members of his family, including his daughter, begun to open up about the man he truly was. What they revealed painted a far more layered portrait than the one Hollywood sold to the public. Beneath the tough exterior was a man shaped by childhood poverty, wartime trauma, and relentless ambition. His story is one of resilience and reinvention, a tale far more complex, more tragic, and more inspiring than we ever realized. Stay with us as we uncover the story of the real Charles Bronson. To truly understand Bronson's journey, we have to strip away the layers of myth that he himself often built around his past. We have to go back, not to the glamorous days of red carpets and film sets, but to the gray, soot-covered hills of Pennsylvania where his story began. Born Charles Bukinski, though some records list him as Binsky, on November 3, 1921, in the small coal mining town of Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, he was one of 15 children born to a Lithuanian immigrant family. Life in Ehrenfeld was unforgiving. The mines ruled everything: work, health, and the futures of the families that lived there. For young Charles, poverty wasn't just a phase. It was the air he breathed, the constant struggle that shaped every moment of his childhood. From his earliest years, Bronson felt the weight of deprivation. He often went without shoes, and clothing was whatever could be salvaged or shared among siblings. Family members recalled that he sometimes wore his sister's hand-me-down dresses to school because there was nothing else. Whether or not every detail of that memory is accurate has been debated. His first wife, Harriet Tendler, would later suggest it was more of a story he liked to embellish, but the fact remains that the Bronson children grew up with less than the bare minimum. Humiliation, hunger, and hardship were constants. He even shaved his head at times to keep lice at bay, a small but telling detail of just how relentless poverty was in that environment. Then, when Charles was only 10 years old, tragedy struck. His father, a miner, died of black lung disease, a fate that claimed the lives of many men who worked the coal seams. Suddenly, survival became even harder for the already struggling Bukinski family. Charles, barely more than a child, was thrust into a world where responsibility outweighed innocence. His childhood was over almost as soon as it began. By the age of 16, he was working in the mines himself, hauling coal deep underground for just $1 per ton. Those years in the mines left marks on him: physical, emotional, and psychological. He developed chronic headaches, carried scars on his hands and body, and lived with an ever-present claustrophobia that came from spending long hours in cramped, dark tunnels. Later in life, when he was already a famous actor, he would refer to his hands as unsightly, a lingering reminder of the backbreaking labor he endured in his youth. The smell of coal dust, he claimed, never truly left him. Bronson sometimes tried to lighten the weight of those years by spinning tales that blurred fact and fiction. In interviews, he told reporters that he hadn't spoken a word of English until high school, or that his mother had once sold him to traveling gypsies, or that he had spent years in nothing but women's clothing because there were no other options. His first wife, Harriet, laughed off many of these claims, insisting they were exaggerations, even outright fabrications. But whether true or not, the stories served a purpose. They created an aura of mystery, a mythology around Bronson's past, that both fascinated journalists and protected the private man behind the tough mask. And in some sense, those myths weren't too far from reality. Even without embellishment, his youth had been harder than most people could imagine. What stands out through all the stories, real or exaggerated, is that hardship was the crucible in which Charles Bronson was forged. Poverty left him with an instinct for survival, a determination to claw his way out of obscurity, and an iron will that would later translate into the stoic screen persona audiences came to know. But at this point in his life, Hollywood wasn't even a distant dream. For the young coal miner from Ehrenfeld, life was about survival, 1 ton of coal at a time. For young Charles Bronson, or Charles Bukinski as he was still known then, the years in the mines seemed like a life sentence. He worked in suffocating tunnels, carrying the weight of coal and responsibility on his back. But the world was changing, and soon his life would change with it. In 1943, with the Second World War raging across Europe and the Pacific, Charles was drafted into the United States Army. For a boy who once joked about standing on a street corner with a milk bottle in hand, ready to rob someone just to get by, the call to serve was more than a duty. It was an escape from the mines, a chance to prove himself in a world far larger than Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania. Assigned to the Air Corps, Bronson became a gunner, stationed in the Pacific Theater. Reports later suggested that he flew as a tail gunner on a bomber, participating in as many as 26 combat missions. The details of his service were something he rarely spoke about openly, even to those closest to him. Like many veterans of his generation, Bronson carried his memories in silence, speaking only occasionally and even then with reluctance. His daughter would later say that although he rarely shared stories of the war, she could see in his eyes that those experiences had left a permanent impression on him. The life of a tail gunner was among the most dangerous roles in World War II. Crammed into the rear of a bomber plane with only a small window and a machine gun, gunners had some of the shortest life expectancies of any soldiers in the air. They were the first targets of enemy fire, and survival rates were slim. Whether Bronson completed 26 missions or fewer, one fact is certain. He put his life on the line time and again, and though he did not talk much about it, the war gave him something he had been missing all his life: pride and a sense of purpose. But his service was not without incident. In the book Bronson's Loose Again, author Paul Talbot recounted a story Bronson once shared about a confrontation during gunnery training in Kingman, Arizona. Frustrated with a sergeant, Bronson admitted that he picked the man up and threw him. "For some reason, I thought as long as I didn't hit him, I wouldn't get into trouble," Bronson later said. But when the sergeant landed, his arm broke. The punishment was swift, 6 months of hard labor. Bronson spent that time hauling garbage and lugging heavy sides of beef, grueling tasks that might have broken another man but instead left him more determined than ever. It was a humbling experience, one that reminded him of the brutal discipline of the mines. Despite this setback, Bronson's military career ended honorably. He earned commendations for his service and was discharged in 1946. But more importantly, he left the Army with a new outlook. The boy who had grown up in rags, who had struggled to survive each day in the coal mines, was now a man who had seen the world, faced death, and returned with discipline and pride. The Army gave him what the mines never could: a belief in his own strength and a glimpse of possibilities beyond the narrow streets of his hometown. Yet, when Bronson returned to civilian life, he did not step into instant success. Like many veterans, he faced the challenge of starting over. The GI Bill allowed him certain opportunities, but at first, he drifted from job to job. He worked as a baker in Philadelphia, where the daily grind of kneading dough was a far cry from the roar of bomber planes. Later, he found himself working as a bingo caller on the Atlantic City Pier, announcing numbers to bored tourists. At one point, he painted signs and theater scenery, putting to use the artistic skills he had developed as a boy. These jobs were modest, sometimes humiliating, but they kept him afloat while he searched for a greater calling. It was through this unexpected skill, painting, that Bronson stumbled onto the path that would change his life. While helping with stage backdrops, he came into contact with a group of actors. They noticed not just his skill with a brush, but also his quiet intensity, his strong presence even when he said little. They invited him to get involved in small theatrical productions, first behind the scenes, then eventually on stage. Though Bronson had never imagined himself as a performer, something about the world of acting appealed to him. It offered an escape from the anonymity of hard labor, a chance to step into different lives and perhaps to reinvent his own. At first he was hesitant. Acting was foreign, unpredictable, even intimidating. But his friends encouraged him to give it a try, and when he finally stepped on stage, he felt something click. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was creating. He discovered that performance gave him a sense of control and freedom that nothing else had. In the coal mines, he had been a nameless worker. In the army, he had been a soldier, one among thousands. But on stage, even in the smallest roles, he felt recognized, seen. Still, it would be years before Charles Bronson became a household name. The road ahead was long and filled with struggle, but the turning point had come. The coal miner's son, the hardened veteran, was now stepping onto a path that would carry him all the way to Hollywood. When Charles Bronson first dipped his toes into acting, it was less about chasing fame and more about survival and exploration. He wasn't born with the dream of stardom like so many who flocked to Hollywood. Instead, it was a gradual discovery, fueled by chance encounters and the encouragement of others. After experimenting with stage performances and finding a certain comfort in inhabiting characters, he realized acting might be more than just a hobby. But the road to Hollywood was never easy, and for Bronson, it would be as grueling as the coal mines he had left behind. In the late 1940s, Bronson used the GI Bill to study art and acting, enrolling in classes at the Pasadena Playhouse and, later, attending acting workshops in New York. He was quiet, observant, and not particularly polished, but he had something that caught attention: presence. Directors and fellow students noticed that when he walked into a room, people looked. He didn't have to say much. His silence carried weight. But in the world of performance, where charisma and eloquence were often the golden tickets, Bronson stood out for his rawness, his authenticity, and his unwillingness to soften his edges. In those early years, however, his looks and demeanor worked against him as much as they worked for him. He wasn't conventionally handsome in the way leading men of the time were. Hollywood was still enamored with the polished charm of actors like Rock Hudson or the boyish good looks of Tony Curtis. Bronson, by contrast, had a rugged face etched with hardship, eyes that carried both pain and fire, and a heavy, muscular frame that made him seem more like a laborer than a matinee idol. Casting directors didn't know what to do with him at first. He was too intense, too foreign-looking, too different. Adding to his struggles was his last name, Bukinski. During the height of McCarthyism in the 1950s, when suspicion of Eastern European heritage could derail careers, having a Lithuanian name wasn't exactly an advantage. Agents warned him that his birth name would hold him back. Reluctantly, he agreed to change it, and thus Charles Bronson was born. The new name had a sharpness to it, a bite that matched his screen presence. And though it was a small change, it was symbolic. He was shedding one more piece of his old life to fully embrace the new. Bronson's early career was built on small roles, often uncredited. He played soldiers, thugs, henchmen, and laborers, parts that required toughness more than dialogue. In 1951, he made his film debut in You're in the Navy Now, starring Gary Cooper. His role was so minor that many viewers missed him entirely, but for Bronson, it was the first step. Over the next several years, he appeared in a string of films and television shows, slowly carving out a niche. On television, he became a familiar face in westerns, which were incredibly popular at the time. Series like The Adventures of Rin, Tin Tin, Gunsmoke, and Have Gun Will travel gave him opportunities to showcase his stoicism and intensity. Even when his characters had few lines, audiences noticed the way he filled the screen with his silent menace. He wasn't the kind of actor who begged for attention. He commanded it without effort. Still, despite steady work, fame remained elusive. Bronson often struggled financially during this period. His wife, Harriet Tendler, whom he had married in 1949, supported him both emotionally and practically. She worked tirelessly, often taking jobs to keep the household afloat while Bronson pursued acting. In her memoir, she recalled the lean years vividly. Times when they lived in tiny apartments, when paying bills was a constant worry, and when success seemed like a distant dream. But Harriet also believed in him, seeing the fire in him even when he doubted himself. Throughout the 1950s, Bronson gradually climbed the ladder, moving from nameless roles to more substantial supporting parts. In 1954, he had a small but memorable role in Vera Cruz, starring Gary Cooper and Burt Lancaster. In 1957, he appeared in Machine Gun Kelly, directed by Roger Corman, which gave him one of his first real chances to carry a film. Though it was a low-budget project, Bronson's performance as the notorious gangster was chilling and magnetic. Critics took notice, and for the first time, his name began to carry some weight. Even so, Hollywood was slow to embrace him as a leading man. Instead, he became the quintessential tough guy, cast in roles that highlighted his ruggedness. He appeared in The Magnificent Seven in 1960, playing Bernardo O'Reilly, a hired gun with a sense of honor. Though surrounded by stars like Steve McQueen and Yul Brynner, Bronson stood out. His performance was restrained but powerful, and it resonated with audiences. Similarly, in The Great Escape, 1963, he played Danny, the claustrophobic tunnel digger, a role that drew directly from his own real-life experiences in the mines. Viewers didn't know it, but when Bronson's character panicked in those tight underground tunnels, the fear on his face wasn't entirely an act. He was channeling genuine memories of suffocation and confinement. These roles earned him respect in Hollywood, even if superstardom still eluded him. He was admired by directors for his professionalism, by co-stars for his quiet intensity, and by audiences for his authenticity. But in the United States, he remained something of an enigma, a supporting actor, a reliable presence, but not yet a star. Ironically, it would take leaving America for Bronson to find the recognition that had always escaped him. By the late 1960s, European filmmakers began to take notice of him. Directors in France, Italy, and the UK admired his rugged masculinity and the fact that he wasn't a polished Hollywood type. To them, he embodied something raw and real, something that audiences craved. When Bronson traveled overseas to work on projects, he was received like a superstar. Films like Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968, showcased him as a leading man, finally giving him the chance to dominate the screen in ways Hollywood had long denied him. Back in America, his fame grew slowly but steadily. He was no longer just a supporting actor. He was becoming a brand, a persona, a figure audiences recognized and respected. And while it had taken years of grueling work, rejection, and typecasting, Charles Bronson was finally standing on the threshold of stardom. The boy from the coal mines, the soldier who had faced death in the skies, the struggling actor scraping by in the shadows of Hollywood, he was now on the verge of becoming one of the most iconic tough guys in cinematic history. By the dawn of the 1970s, Charles Bronson had crossed a threshold few could have predicted. For nearly 2 decades, he had been grinding away in Hollywood, cast as the silent tough in the background, the man who rarely got the girl and almost never got top billing. But now, after winning acclaim in Europe, he returned to America as a bona fide star. The world was changing, and so was cinema. Audiences no longer wanted only polished heroes and clean-cut charm. They wanted grit, realism, and the kind of hardened masculinity Bronson embodied effortlessly. His time had finally come. In 1972, Bronson starred in The Mechanic, playing a professional hitman who trains a younger apprentice, portrayed by Jan Michael, Vincent. The film captured everything that made Bronson unique: the cold precision, the stoic demeanor, and the ability to say volumes without speaking more than a handful of lines. That same year, he starred in Chatto's Land, a Western about a half-Apache man forced into a violent standoff with settlers. Both films showcased Bronson not as a supporting presence, but as the central figure, a man whose intensity could carry an entire story. Then came the role that would define his career: Paul Kersey in Death Wish, 1974. The film told the story of an architect who becomes a vigilante after his wife is murdered and his daughter assaulted. To many, the film was controversial, even disturbing, but to audiences of the time it struck a raw nerve. Crime was on the rise in American cities, and the fantasy of one man taking justice into his own hands resonated deeply. Bronson's portrayal of Kersey, a man pushed to the brink who answers violence with violence, cemented him as a cultural icon. The film spawned multiple sequels, each more brutal and stylized than the last, but together they carved Bronson's image into the bedrock of 1970s and 1980s cinema. Yet for all his fame, Bronson remained an enigma. Off-screen, he was intensely private. He avoided the Hollywood party scene, disliked giving interviews, and rarely opened up about his personal life. Co-stars often described him as reserved but professional, a man who showed up, did his job, and went home. He wasn't interested in schmoozing or self-promotion. In fact, his stoicism off-screen often mirrored the characters he played. But those who knew him intimately described another side. His first marriage to Harriet Tendler had lasted for years, surviving through the lean times of his early career, but ultimately ended in divorce in 1965. Not long after, he met British actress Jill Ireland, who became not only his wife but his most frequent co-star. The two appeared together in more than a dozen films, including The Mechanic and Breakout. Their relationship was passionate and enduring, and Bronson often credited Jill as his anchor, the one person who could soften his hard edges. Tragically, Jill Ireland was diagnosed with breast cancer in the 1980s, and the couple faced the battle together. Bronson, who so often seemed invulnerable, became her caretaker, standing by her side through treatments, setbacks, and struggles. When she passed away in 1990, it devastated him. Friends said he never fully recovered from the loss. Despite remarrying, later the shadow of Jill lingered over the rest of his life. As the years went on, Bronson continued to work steadily, though his films became increasingly formulaic. Sequels to Death Wish dominated his later career, each one pushing the vigilante theme to new extremes. Critics were often harsh, accusing the films of glorifying violence, but audiences remained loyal. They didn't come to see Charles Bronson wrestle with Shakespearean dialogue or romantic subplots. They came to see him embody justice in its rawest, most uncompromising form, and Bronson delivered, time and again. Behind the scenes, however, Bronson was not the cold, detached figure many assumed. His children recalled him as a caring father, though sometimes distant, shaped by the hardness of his upbringing. His daughter later revealed that he had a dry sense of humor and could be surprisingly gentle, qualities the public rarely got to see. He loved art, often sketching or painting in his spare time, and he valued privacy above all. Fame, to him, was a necessity of the job, not a lifestyle to be enjoyed. By the 1990s, Bronson's health began to decline. Years of smoking and the toll of age caught up with him. He suffered from chronic illnesses, including heart problems and later Alzheimer's disease. The man who had once seemed unbreakable, a living embodiment of toughness, grew frail. In 2003, Charles Bronson passed away at the age of 81, leaving behind not just a filmography, but a legend. His death marked the end of an era in Hollywood, the era of the rugged, stoic anti-hero, yet even in death his legacy remains complicated. To some, he was the ultimate tough guy, a symbol of justice and vengeance. To others, his films represented a dangerous glorification of violence. But to those who knew him personally, he was something else entirely, a man shaped by poverty, trauma, and resilience, who used acting as both an escape and a weapon. His daughter's revelations in recent years have reminded fans that Bronson was more than just his screen persona. He was a man who endured incredible hardship, who found love and loss, who lived with contradictions, and who carried the scars of his past until the very end. The real Charles Bronson was not just the stone-faced killer Hollywood made him out to be. He was a survivor, a father, a husband, and an artist. His life was proof that even the harshest beginnings can lead to extraordinary outcomes. He may have been silent on screen, but his story speaks volumes, a reminder that behind every myth lies a man, and behind every legend, a human being.